Every morning the man walked the same road beside the forest, and every morning he stopped and said thank you to his dog, not because his life was in danger, not because the dog had just saved him. The truth was harder to explain. The dog was getting older, slower, quieter, and for the first time in his life, the man realized something terrifying. One day, the protector would no longer protect. So why did he still say, thank you? Because gratitude is not only for what saves us. Sometimes it is for what stays with us while God teaches us how to keep going. This is not a story about war.
It's safe now.
It is a story about learning how to live when everything begins to change. Winter had settled deep over the small town of Pine Hollow, pressing snow into every corner until the place felt quieter than it looked. The town lay at the edge of a northern forest that had outlived most things built by people, its trees standing tall and close together, their branches heavy with white. The morning air was dry and cold, carrying the sharp scent of pine sap and frozen earth. The sky hung low and pale, diffusing the light until nothing cast a hard shadow. Pine Hollow did not fight winter, it learned to live inside it. Caleb Rowan stepped out from the narrow porch of his rented house just as the sun began to climb, though it offered little warmth. Snow creaked softly beneath his boots as he reached the packed road that traced the forest's edge. He moved without hurry, his posture upright but relaxed, as if his body understood that speed was unnecessary here. Caleb was in his mid-40s, tall and solidly built, though time had pulled his strength inward. His shoulders were broad but no longer tense. His dark brown hair, cut short for convenience rather than style, had begun to gray at the temples. His face was composed, marked by faint lines earned from long periods of watchfulness rather than expression. He dressed simply, a heavy wool coat, insulated pants, gloves worn smooth at the palms, boots chosen for grip and endurance. Nothing about him suggested what he had once been. That, too, was intentional. At his side walked Morrigan. She was a German shepherd, 10 years old, her age evident not in weakness but in economy. Her frame was lean and balanced, her movements deliberate rather than quick. A thick winter coat darkened her silhouette, black along her back and shoulders, fading into deep brown around her legs and chest. Frost gathered lightly along her whiskers, giving her muzzle a grizzled dignity. Her ears stood upright but relaxed, angled to receive rather than challenge. Her eyes were dark and steady, holding the quiet intelligence of an animal that had learned restraint through experience. Morrigan did not strain against the leash or lag behind. She walked in close alignment with Caleb, adjusting her pace instinctively to match his. They followed the snow-packed road where weeks of passing vehicles and boots had compressed the surface into something firm and reliable. The forest stood just beyond the shallow ditch at the roadside, its presence constant and close. Snow clung to every branch, muffling sound and shrinking distance. The cold sharpened what little noise remained, yet absorbed it quickly, leaving the world wrapped in a dense stillness. Caleb inhaled slowly, feeling the chill settle into his lungs. Morrigan's breath rose beside him in even, measured clouds. Near a slight bend where the trees leaned closer, Caleb stopped. Morrigan halted with him, her posture unchanged, weight evenly distributed across all four paws. Her tail hung low and still. She did not look at him. She did not need to. Caleb let his shoulders ease and allowed the moment to settle. Snow slipped from a high branch somewhere above, landing without sound. "Thank you," he said quietly. The words were soft, unforced, spoken as if they were already familiar to the air. There was no reverence in his tone, no emotion that needed explanation. It was not a command, and it was not a confession. Morrigan did not react outwardly. Her ears shifted slightly, just enough to acknowledge sound. That was all. This was how their mornings began. The habit had not formed all at once. It had taken shape during Caleb's first winter in Pine Hollow, when silence had felt heavier than noise and days had stretched without structure. The thank you was not tied to memory or survival. It was not an echo of his past as a Navy SEAL. It was a way of marking the present, of reminding himself that this moment required nothing beyond attention and care. They resumed walking. A short distance ahead, a figure emerged from between two houses set back from the road. Margaret Hale stepped carefully onto the packed snow, pulling her scarf tighter around her neck. She was in her late 60s, small in stature, her posture slightly stooped from years of labor and cold. Gray hair escaped in wisps from beneath her knitted hat. Margaret had lived in Pine Hollow all her life. The winters had shaped her movements and her temperament, teaching her patience and caution in equal measure. She paused when she saw Caleb and Morrigan, offering a brief nod and a reserved smile. She did not speak. Caleb returned the nod. Words were unnecessary. In Pine Hollow, familiarity was measured by presence, not conversation. Morrigan glanced once toward Margaret, her gaze calm and uninterested, then returned her attention to the path. There was no assessment that required action. As they passed, Caleb shortened his stride slightly. Morrigan's left hind leg showed a trace of stiffness in the cold, a detail he had learned to notice over time. He adjusted without thinking, and Morrigan responded by easing her pace, the coordination between them practiced and quiet. The road curved gently, drawing them closer to the forest. The trees loomed taller here, their trunks thick and dark beneath the snow. Caleb was aware of the layered weight resting along the slopes beyond the visible edge of the road, snow held in place by nothing more than cold and balance. He did not dwell on it. Winter demanded awareness, not imagination. His attention remained on what was directly in front of him, the texture of the ground, the way light reflected differently where ice lay beneath the surface, the subtle tension in the leash that communicated Morrigan's position without effort. Morrigan mirrored that attention, her body composed, her movements precise but unhurried. Caleb felt grounded in these details. The weight of his coat, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the certainty of each step. There was no urgency in him, no need to scan for threats that did not exist. Peace, he had learned, was not the absence of danger, but the ability to recognize when danger was not present. They reached the point where the road sloped gently back toward town. The forest remained unchanged behind them, silent and heavy with snow. Morrigan paused as Caleb paused, her presence solid and unquestioning. "Thank you," he said again. This time the words carried no reflection at all. They were simply acknowledgment. For the cold, for the quiet, for the shared understanding that this morning, like many others, asked only for patience. They turned back toward Pine Hollow. Snow continued to fall in fine, nearly invisible flakes. The town waited, unchanged, contained within the winter. The day ahead remained intact, undemanding, and Caleb walked into it without hurry. The winter morning held its shape as Caleb, Rowan, and Morrigan moved along the forest road, the world unchanged on the surface. Snow lay packed hard beneath their feet, dulled by repetition and cold. The trees stood close and tall, their branches heavy, the forest breathing in slow, shallow intervals. Nothing moved beyond the faint drift of powder falling from time to time. Nothing asked for attention. It was the kind of quiet that felt earned rather than fragile. Caleb walked with his hands relaxed at his sides, his shoulders loose beneath his coat. His breathing had found its rhythm again, steady and unforced. The previous day's stillness lingered, familiar enough to be trusted. He did not scan the forest deliberately, but awareness lived just under the surface, ready without being restless. This road had taught him that vigilance did not always need direction. Morrigan stayed close at his left, her gait measured, her paws placing themselves carefully on the compressed snow. Age had refined her movement, stripping away excess energy and leaving behind precision. Her ears were upright but soft, angled toward the forest without challenging it. She moved as though the cold, the trees, and the silence were known quantities, not variables. The sound arrived without warning. It was sharp and metallic, brief enough to vanish almost as soon as it appeared. A scrape, followed by a muted clatter, out of place against the padded quiet of snow and wood. It did not echo. It did not repeat. It existed for a single moment, and then was gone. Caleb stopped. The reaction came before thought, before meaning. His muscles tightened, his breath caught mid-draw, his weight shifting back in preparation for movement that no longer had a destination. The forest ahead ceased to be neutral. Lines hardened, space narrowed. His pulse surged into efficiency, the old pattern waking as if it had never slept. He waited. Morrigan did nothing. She did not step forward or pull back. Her posture remained unchanged, balanced and grounded. Her tail stayed low, still. Only her ears adjusted slightly, tracking the direction the sound had come from, then settling again. There was no tension in her body, no signal that required interpretation. She remained present, calm, unalarmed. That absence of response struck Caleb harder than the sound itself. He stood frozen for a moment longer, waiting for instruction that did not come. For years he had learned to read the smallest shifts in Morrigan's movement, to trust the information she offered without question. Her silence now left him exposed to his own instincts, unfiltered. The world did not move. Caleb forced his breath to continue. He scanned the area ahead with conscious intent this time, letting logic reassert itself. Snowbanks along the roadside, a leaning utility pole, a length of old metal half buried near the edge, loosened by freeze and thaw. Wind nudged it again, producing a softer scrape as it settled back into place. Nothing dangerous, nothing requiring action. His shoulders eased, but the echo of readiness did not fully release. It lingered, faint but unmistakable. They moved forward again, slower now, not from caution, but from recalibration. Morrigan walked as she had before, her pace unchanged, her attention distributed evenly between the road and the forest. She did not look back at the metal. Whatever threshold it had not crossed hers. As they passed the source of the sound, Caleb felt the leash between them, loose and unstrained. He realized how often, without acknowledging it, he had waited for that connection to tighten, for Morrigan to tell him when to move and when to stop. The habit had formed quietly, reinforced by years when that system had worked without fail. Now, faced with her stillness, he recognized it for what it was. He had been leaning, not physically, not obviously, but inwardly, trusting her reactions to define safety. Morrigan had never asked for that role. She had simply performed it when needed. The responsibility, he realized, had always been his. They reached a narrow stretch where the forest pressed closer, branches arching overhead under the weight of snow. Caleb slowed again, not because of the terrain, but because awareness demanded it. He adjusted his stance, feeling the ground through the soles of his boots, judging stability for himself rather than waiting for confirmation. Morrigan mirrored the change without prompting, her presence steady and unintrusive. She was not leading. She was not following. She was simply there. At the far edge of their route, Caleb stopped once more. The forest remained silent. No further sounds broke the air. The moment passed without incident. He did not speak. There was no thank you this time, no ritual to soften the realization settling into place. The sound had done what it came to do. It had woken something old, not fear, but dependence, and left him standing with it. Morrigan waited beside him, patient and composed, offering nothing beyond her quiet certainty. She did not correct him. She did not reassure him. She did not need to. Caleb turned back toward the town, the road ahead familiar and unchanged. Morrigan followed, her stride falling into sync with his once more. The forest receded behind them, the metal silent again beneath the snow. The morning continued as before. No accident, no harm. But the balance between them had shifted, subtle and undeniable, like snow settling under its own weight, reshaping the ground without ever making a sound. The day unfolded without ceremony, the winter light never fully lifting from Pine Hollow. Snow continued to fall in thin, dry flakes that settled without sound, smoothing over footprints almost as soon as they were made. The forest remained close and watchful, its presence steady rather than threatening. From the outside, nothing had changed since the morning walk. From the inside, Caleb felt a slow shift he could not ignore. He moved through the small house with quiet precision, shedding his coat and boots, setting them in their places as if order itself were a form of reassurance. The heater clicked softly, struggling against the cold. Morrigan crossed the room and lay down near the window where she could see the road and the trees beyond it. Her movements were careful, unhurried, each adjustment measured. Caleb noticed how she lowered herself a fraction more slowly than she once had, how she took an extra moment to settle her weight before resting her head on her paws. The rule had always been simple. If Morrigan did not react, the world was safe. It was a rule born not from theory, but from repetition, reinforced by nights and days when hesitation meant survival, and misjudgment meant consequences that could not be undone. Caleb had learned to trust the smallest signals in her body, the tension in her stance, the way her breathing changed when something unseen crossed an invisible threshold. Over time, the rule had grown absolute. It freed his mind from constant calculation. It allowed him to move forward without hesitation, to stand down without doubt. Now, sitting in the quiet of the house, he felt that certainty thinning. Morrigan lifted her head briefly when a truck passed outside, then lowered it again. No concern, no alert. The sound faded. Caleb watched her closely, not searching for danger, but for confirmation. He found only calm. He turned away, unsettled by his own attention. Later, he stepped back outside to clear the short walkway leading from the porch to the road. The shovel scraped softly against packed snow, the motion familiar and grounding. His breath fogged in front of him, rising and vanishing. Morrigan remained inside, watching from her place by the window, her eyes following his movements without urgency. She did not rise to join him. That, too, was new. The work was simple. The path did not require much effort, only time. As he worked, Caleb's thoughts returned to the morning sound, not as a threat, but as a marker. The sound itself had been meaningless. What mattered was what followed. Morrigan's stillness, his waiting. He realized then that the rule had never been about safety alone. It had been about permission, permission to relax, permission to stop scanning, permission to believe that someone else was holding the line. The shovel struck a patch of ice, jarring his hands. The sensation was sharp but brief. He paused, steadying himself, then adjusted his angle and continued. No reaction from the house behind him. Morrigan did not rise. She trusted him to manage the moment on his own. By the time he finished, the cold had crept deeper into his gloves. He went inside, closed the door, and leaned against it for a moment longer than necessary. The house remained quiet. Morrigan had shifted position, her body angled toward the hallway now, alert but relaxed. She was older. He could no longer pretend otherwise. Age had not taken her strength all at once. It revealed itself in small negotiations. The slower rise, the careful turn, the way she conserved energy without losing awareness. She was still capable, still steady, but the margin she once carried had narrowed. Caleb sat at the small kitchen table, a mug warming his hands. He did not drink right away. His gaze stayed on Morrigan, who watched him with the same composed attention she always had. There was no question in her eyes, no uncertainty. The rule had begun to break, not because she had failed, but because time had begun to change the terms. That afternoon they walked again, this time along the shorter path closer to town. The snow here was more compacted, the road wider, the forest held at a respectful distance. Caleb chose the route deliberately, though he did not acknowledge the choice out loud. Morrigan accepted it without comment, her pace easy, her posture unchanged. As they moved, Caleb paid attention to details he had once delegated. The slope of the ground, the sound of wind moving through bare branches, the way snow shifted underfoot when the surface gave way to powder. He did not feel fear. He felt responsibility. Morrigan stayed beside him, her presence steady but no longer directive. She offered information without instruction. It was Caleb's task now to decide what to do with it. They passed by the edge of town where the houses thinned and the road curved back toward the trees. Caleb slowed, considering, then continued on without stopping. The forest did not pull at him the way it once had. He did not need to test it today. When they turned back, Morrigan lagged by half a step, just briefly, before adjusting again. Caleb matched her pace without thinking. The movement felt natural, almost overdue. The rule echoed in his mind as they walked. If Morrigan does not react, the world is safe. It had never accounted for what happened when she could not react the way she once did. It had never asked what remained when certainty eroded. As the town came back into view, Caleb understood that the rule was not disappearing. It was changing. It could no longer be absolute. It could no longer carry the weight alone. That night, the house settled into its familiar winter quiet. Morrigan lay near the heater, her breathing slow and even. Caleb sat nearby, the light dim, his thoughts contained. He did not reach for her. He did not speak. There was no need to fill the space. The rule that had once kept him alive had done its work. It had brought him this far. Now it was asking him to take the next step himself. He accepted that without ceremony, the way he accepted most truths now, quietly, without resistance. Outside, snow continued to fall, patient and indifferent. Inside, Caleb and Morrigan shared the same stillness, no longer defined by certainty, but by choice. The world remained intact. Only the balance had shifted. The wind shifted just before noon, not stronger at first, only different. It slid down from the hills and cut across the frozen inlet that served as Pine Hollow's small harbor, carrying with it a sharper cold and a restless edge. The water was dark and sluggish beneath thin plates of ice that knocked gently against one another. Snow lay piled along the docks, pressed flat where boots had passed earlier in the morning, untouched elsewhere. The harbor had always been a place of quiet work and predictable rhythms. Today it felt slightly misaligned. Caleb arrived along the planked walkway with Morrigan at his side, the boards creaking softly beneath their weight. He had chosen this route deliberately, a change from the forest road without acknowledging the reason even to himself. The harbor was open, visible, bounded by structure. It offered fewer unknowns. His posture remained calm, but his attention was spread wide, taking in the angle of the docks, the way the ice shifted near the pilings, the tension in the air that came with the changing wind. Morrigan walked a half-step closer to him than usual, not pressing, simply nearer. Her movement was economical, careful on the slick surface. The cold had stiffened her slightly, and she compensated with precision rather than force. Her ears angled forward, then eased back, tracking the wind more than the sounds it carried. She was alert, but not concerned. Farther along the dock, a small group of townspeople moved between tied boats and storage sheds. Daniel Crow stood nearest the water, tall and lean, his posture slightly hunched against the cold. In his early 50s, Daniel had spent most of his life working the harbor, his face permanently weathered by wind and reflected light off the water. He spoke little and trusted routines more than people. Nearby, Ellen Moore moved with quick, practiced steps, shorter and sturdier, her movements efficient. She had taken over her family's small transport business years earlier, learning early that hesitation on the dock could cost time or worse. They worked without conversation, each aware of the other's presence. The wind strengthened abruptly, sweeping across the harbor and threading itself between the boats. Lines creaked. One rope snapped tight against a cleat with a sharp report that cut through the air, metallic and sudden. The sound carried across the dock, echoing off the storage sheds before fading. People froze. Daniel's hands stilled on the line he had been coiling. Ellen stopped mid-step, her boot hovering just above the planks. Further down, another worker straightened, scanning the rigging overhead. It was not panic. It was instinct, old and shared. The harbor knew how to demand attention. Caleb stopped as well, the reaction immediate but controlled. His breath slowed rather than caught this time. He noted the source of the sound, the direction of the wind, the angle of the boat that had shifted against its moorings. He waited, not for the noise to repeat, but for confirmation. Morrigan did not pull him back. She did not move forward either. Instead, she adjusted her stance, spreading her weight slightly, her paws gripping the planks with more intention. Her head lifted a fraction. A low sound passed through her throat, so quiet it barely registered as sound at all. It was not a warning. It was a signal of attention. That was all. Caleb felt the absence of pressure on the leash, the lack of instruction he once would have followed without question. The moment stretched, brief but complete. The wind tugged again at the lines. Ice scraped softly against wood. He stepped back. The movement was small, controlled, and entirely his own. He shifted his weight away from the edge of the dock, guiding Morrigan with him not by force, but by position. She followed instantly, matching his adjustment without resistance. The leash remained loose between them. A second later, the rope that had snapped tight earlier slid free of its hold and fell, slapping wetly against the planks where Caleb had been standing moments before. Water sprayed up, dark and cold, leaving irregular patterns on the snow-dusted wood. No one spoke. Daniel let out a slow breath and secured the remaining lines with practiced efficiency. Ellen stepped back into motion, her jaw set, her attention already moving to the next task. The harbor absorbed the interruption and continued, as it always did. Caleb stood where he had stopped, his heart rate steady, his mind clear. He felt no rush of adrenaline, no delayed tremor, only recognition. Morrigan remained beside him, her posture easing once the tension passed. She did not look at the fallen rope. She did not seek his attention. Her work was done. Caleb realized, with quiet certainty, that he had not waited for her to pull him clear. He had not needed to. The decision had been his, informed by her presence, but not dictated by it. The distinction mattered more than the outcome. They moved on once the path ahead cleared, walking the length of the dock without incident. The wind settled into a steadier pattern, less erratic now that it had declared itself. The harbor returned to its routines, the earlier pause already fading from collective memory. As Caleb and Morrigan turned back toward the street, the planks beneath their boots felt solid again. The town rose ahead of them, unchanged, its buildings small against the winter sky. Morrigan's pace matched his easily, her breathing even. Caleb did not speak. There was no need to mark the moment with words. The change had already taken place, quiet and irreversible. He had moved himself. Morrigan had trusted him to do so. The harbor remained behind them, turning inward once more, holding its balance as it always had. The wind continued on its way, indifferent, and Caleb carried forward something new, subtle but firm, settling into place where a rule once stood. Night settled over Pine Hollow with a quiet finality. Snow fell in fine, dry grains that softened the edges of the town and erased the last tracks of the day. The street lights cast pale circles on the ground, their glow swallowed quickly by the dark. Beyond the houses, the forest stood heavy and unmoving, its presence felt more than seen. Winter pressed inward, steady and unhurried. Inside the small house, the air was warm but spare. The heater ticked at irregular intervals, a thin mechanical sound that never quite became background noise. Caleb Rowan sat on the edge of the bed, boots removed, coat folded with care, and set on the chair nearby. The room held little decoration. A dresser, a narrow window, a lamp turned low. Everything was placed for use, not comfort. Morrigan lay on the floor near the foot of the bed, her body stretched out but alert. In the dim light, her dark coat blended into the shadows, her outline defined only by the slow rise and fall of her breathing. She had chosen this spot herself, close enough to be present, far enough not to intrude. Age had taught her where rest ended and vigilance began. Caleb lay back and closed his eyes. Sleep came quickly, as it often did, but it did not come gently. The dream did not announce itself. There were no images at first, only sensation, pressure, confinement. A weight that did not belong to gravity alone. His chest tightened as if the air had been drawn thin. Sound faded until there was only a dull, internal echo, the memory of metal shifting somewhere out of sight. His body reacted before his mind could form words. Caleb woke sharply, breath caught, heart driving hard against his ribs. The room was unchanged. The lamp still glowed. Snow brushed softly against the window pane. The heater clicked once and fell silent again. There was no danger, no movement, only the residue of something that had not fully released him. He sat up slowly, placing his feet on the cold floor to ground himself. His hands rested on his thighs, fingers spread, feeling for steadiness. He did not scan the room. He did not reach for anything. He waited. Morrigan was already watching him. She had not moved from her place on the floor. Her head was lifted now, her eyes steady and dark, reflecting the low light without urgency. She did not rise. She did not approach. She remained exactly where she was, present without instruction, her breathing unchanged. Caleb's chest eased gradually as his breath found its rhythm again. He felt the familiar impulse rise, the practiced motion of turning toward her, of placing a hand on her shoulder, of speaking the words that had become a habit as reliable as the morning walk. "Thank you." The words formed easily in his mind. He did not say them. The restraint surprised him. It was not forced. It came from a place deeper than thought. He realized, with a clarity that cut sharper than fear, that speaking the words now would give them a weight he was not ready to carry. Gratitude had always been safe when it pointed backward or anchored the present. Tonight it felt different. Tonight it felt like preparation. Caleb understood what he was avoiding. Saying thank you in the dark, after the dream, would mean acknowledging the possibility of absence. It would turn the words into a quiet rehearsal for loss. He was not angry. He was not ungrateful. He was afraid of giving the moment a meaning it did not yet deserve. He stayed silent. Morrigan did not respond to the silence. She did not fill it. She did not question it. Her eyes remained on him, calm and unreadable, her body at rest. If she noticed the absence of words, she gave no sign. She had never required affirmation to do what she did. Caleb leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. He let the last of the dream drain from his body without forcing it away. The room felt smaller now, not threatening, just contained. The forest outside pressed close, invisible but certain, holding its snow and its weight without apology. Minutes passed. The heater clicked again. Somewhere in town, a door closed softly. Life continued at its winter pace. Caleb did not lie back down immediately. He stayed where he was, awake and present, allowing the moment to exist without naming it. The habit of gratitude did not disappear. It waited, patient, as it always had. Eventually, Morrigan lowered her head back onto her paws. The signal was subtle, not permission, but acceptance. The night had settled again. Caleb lay back and closed his eyes once more. Sleep returned more slowly this time, but it returned without struggle. The dream did not follow him. The words remained unsaid, not because they had lost their meaning, but because tonight they held too much of it. Morning returned to Pine Hollow under a sky the color of dull steel. Snow had fallen through the night and now lay thick and undisturbed, smoothing the town into something almost unfinished. The cold felt heavier than the day before, settling into the air with a quiet authority. The forest stood close and still, its branches bowed under the added weight, the world reduced to white, gray, and shadow. Caleb Rowan stepped outside later than usual. The difference was small, but deliberate. He closed the door behind him and paused on the porch, letting the cold reach him before he moved. There was no urgency in his posture, no internal pressure to keep pace with a routine that no longer fit quite the same way. He waited. Morrigan followed him out a moment later. She moved carefully, testing the snow with each step before committing her weight. The stiffness in her left hind leg was more noticeable this morning, though she compensated without complaint, adjusting her balance rather than forcing speed. Her coat was thick and dark against the pale ground, her breath rising in slow, even clouds. Her eyes were clear, attentive, but unhurried. Caleb did not tighten the leash. He did not speak. They reached the road at the edge of town where the snow lay deeper, less compacted than usual. In the past, he would have shortened the route or set the pace without thinking. Today, he waited for Morrigan to choose her rhythm. She took a step, then another, finding her balance before moving on. Caleb matched her without effort, letting his stride fall into alignment with hers. The forest line drew closer as they walked, its presence heavy and quiet. The morning carried no sharp sounds, only the faint settling of snow and the soft press of boots and paws. Caleb kept his attention on the ground ahead, not scanning for threats, but reading the terrain as it was, not as he remembered it to be. A narrow stretch of road sloped gently upward, its surface uneven beneath a thin crust of ice. Morrigan slowed instinctively. Caleb slowed with her. There was no hesitation, no need for correction. He felt the decision take shape without tension, guided by observation rather than habit. They paused briefly where the trees leaned closer, not because of danger, but to rest. Morrigan shifted her weight and stood still, breathing evenly. Caleb waited beside her, hands relaxed, shoulders loose. The cold bit lightly at his fingers, reminding him of the time they were taking. He did not resist it. He thought of the rule he had lived by, the one that had simplified the world into signals and responses. That rule no longer applied here, in this quiet space where nothing demanded speed. What remained was choice. They continued on at the same measured pace. The town behind them receded, its edges softened by falling snow. Caleb noticed the absence of urgency in himself, the way his mind stayed present without effort. Slowing down did not feel like loss. It felt like adjustment. Morrigan walked close, her presence steady, her movements efficient. She did not need to be led. She did not need to lead. She simply moved, and Caleb moved with her. At the far point of their walk, Caleb stopped without signaling. Morrigan stopped as well, not because she was told to, but because the moment asked for it. The forest stood silent, unchanged. Snow drifted down in fine lines that caught briefly in Morrigan's fur before disappearing. Caleb looked at her then. Really looked, not for instruction but for understanding. He saw the age in the careful set of her stance, the wisdom in the way she conserved her energy. He felt no panic, no grief, only respect. "Easy," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Morrigan's ears shifted slightly, acknowledging the sound without responding to it. She remained calm, grounded. They turned back toward Pine Hollow, their path already marked by two sets of tracks, moving in deliberate parallel. Caleb kept his pace matched to hers, not because he had to, but because he chose to. The morning stretched ahead without pressure, the day no longer defined by how much ground they could cover. By the time they reached the edge of town, the sky had lightened just enough to suggest the possibility of change later. The forest remained where it was, patient and indifferent. Caleb did not say, "Thank you," this morning. He did not need to. The decision to slow down together had already spoken for him. The day moved slowly through Pine Hollow, winter light thinning as it slid across the snow and settled into long shadows. The forest held its shape, branches bowed, trunks dark and patient. Nothing announced itself. Nothing needed to. The cold was steady, familiar, no longer something to brace against. Caleb Rowan stood at the kitchen window, watching the road where it curved away from the houses and disappeared toward the trees. The glass was cold beneath his palm. He did not feel the need to move. He had learned recently that stillness could carry its own kind of clarity. Morrigan lay nearby, closer to the heater than she preferred in warmer months. Her body was relaxed, angled in a way that spared her joints. She slept lightly, the kind of sleep that allowed waking without effort. Age had taught her efficiency, even in rest. Caleb thought of gratitude as he had once understood it. A ledger, a debt acknowledged, a balance kept. It had been easy to assign thanks to events that had clear edges, moments that separated before from after. Survival invited gratitude. Rescue demanded it. What unsettled him now was the realization that gratitude did not end there. He had thanked Morrigan for what she had done, for the precision of her instincts, for the way her reactions had once drawn a clean line between danger and safety. Those thanks had come easily. They had weight, but it was a familiar kind. This was different. He watched her breathing slow and even, the rise and fall subtle beneath her thick coat. There was nothing heroic in the scene, no urgency, no proof of usefulness. And yet, the gratitude he felt pressed heavier than any he had known before. It was gratitude without spectacle. Later they walked again, not far, staying close to the houses where the snow was compacted and predictable. The town moved around them in small, contained motions. A door opened and closed. A truck passed at low speed. Someone shoveled without looking up. Pine Hollow did not intrude. It accommodated. Morrigan set the pace not by command, but by necessity. Her steps were measured, careful on the slick patches where ice lay thin beneath the snow. Caleb stayed with her, attentive without hovering. He did not scan ahead for threats. He watched her movement, the way she chose where to place her weight. He understood now that she was no longer a shield. She did not stand between him and the world. She did not intercept risk or absorb it on his behalf. That chapter had closed quietly, without announcement. What remained was something less dramatic and more demanding. She reminded him to stay. They reached the edge of the road where the forest began to assert itself again. The trees stood close, their presence heavier here, the snow deeper and less certain. Caleb stopped without thinking. Morrigan stopped with him, her body angled toward the open space rather than the trees. He felt the old reflex stir, the familiar urge to assess, to push forward simply because retreat once meant failure. That impulse faded as quickly as it came. There was no instruction in Morrigan's posture, no signal that required obedience. Only presence. Caleb turned away from the forest and guided them back toward town. The decision felt complete, not compromised. He did not feel as though he were giving something up. He felt as though he were choosing correctly. As they walked, Caleb considered what courage meant now. It was no longer the act of advancing into uncertainty. It was the willingness to accept change without resisting it, to remain engaged with the world even as it narrowed, even as familiar strengths shifted or faded. Morrigan walked beside him, her head level, her attention open. She did not know the word courage. She lived it without naming it, adjusting to what her body required without resentment or fear. Watching her, Caleb recognized the lesson she offered simply by continuing. At home, he removed his coat and hung it carefully. Morrigan drank from her bowl, then returned to her place near the heater. Caleb sat across from her, close enough to feel the warmth she gave off, distant enough to respect her space. He did not speak. The habit of saying thank you remained with him, but it had changed. It no longer rushed to the surface. It settled deeper, heavier, asking more honesty than routine ever had. Gratitude, he understood now, was not only for what saved him. It was for what stayed. It was for what changed. It was for the quiet courage required to continue, day after day, without the armor he had once relied on. Morrigan shifted slightly, adjusting her position, then grew still again. She did not look at him. She did not need to. Caleb felt the weight of his gratitude settle into something solid, something he could carry without needing to express it aloud. The words would come again when they were ready. For now, it was enough to sit with the understanding. Outside, snow continued to fall, reshaping the town in small, patient increments. Inside, the balance between them held, no longer defined by protection, but by presence. And Caleb remained, learning that staying required its own kind of bravery. Morning arrived clean and sharp. The sky over Pine Hollow was pale, the cold firm but honest. Snow lay packed along the road by the forest, marked only by a few early tracks. The air smelled of pine and ice, clear enough to steady the mind. Caleb Rowan stepped outside and did not pause. He closed the door, set his footing, and moved forward. There was no hesitation in him now, no need to measure the moment before entering it. Morrigan followed, careful but sure. Her steps were deliberate, her balance chosen rather than forced. The years showed in her restraint, not in weakness. Her eyes were open, present. They reached the road together. Caleb adjusted his stride immediately. Not after a moment, not halfway through the step. He aligned himself beside her without effort, shortening nothing, lengthening nothing. He simply matched the pace that was already there. The difference was immediate. Their steps fell into rhythm, side by side, parallel lines pressed into the snow. The forest stood close, but it did not intrude. Caleb acknowledged it and let it remain where it was. They walked. No sounds broke the morning. No wind shifted. Snow slipped quietly from a branch and disappeared into the ground. Neither of them reacted. The moment passed and was complete. At the bend where the road narrowed, Caleb did not slow or stop. He kept the pace they had chosen together. His attention stayed forward, his judgment clear, his body relaxed. Morrigan moved easily beside him. She did not lead. She did not follow. She stayed. At the far edge of their route, Caleb stopped. Morrigan stopped with him. The town lay ahead. The forest stood behind. Nothing pressed for a decision. Caleb looked at her once. He saw the change in her stance, the care in her stillness, the strength that remained without needing display. He felt no urgency, no fear, only recognition. "Thank you," he said. The words were slow, deliberate, unburdened. They were not for what had been survived. They were not for instincts or rescue or protection. They were for now, for choosing this pace, for staying present, for continuing without needing the world to be the same. Morrigan's ears shifted slightly. That was all. They turned back toward Pine Hollow together. Their tracks doubled where they had stood, then continued side by side. The town came into view, quiet and intact. Smoke rose from a chimney. A door opened somewhere and closed again. Life went on. Caleb walked without measuring distance or risk. He no longer waited to be pulled back or pushed forward. The rules that once defined safety no longer governed him. Morrigan stayed beside him, steady and unremarkable in the best way. She was not a shield. She was not a signal. She was company. At the door, Caleb waited for her to step inside first. She did. He followed and closed the door behind them. The morning was complete. The words he had relearned settled into place, light enough to carry, solid enough to trust. Caleb stayed, and that was enough. Some miracles do not arrive with thunder or light. They arrive quietly, in the decision to stay present when life slows us down. Caleb did not find peace because danger disappeared. He found it because he learned to walk at the pace life required of him. He learned that gratitude is not only for what saved us in the past, but for what remains with us when everything begins to change. In many ways, this is how God works in our lives. Not always by removing the storm, but by giving us the strength to stand calmly inside it. Not always by restoring what once was, but by teaching us how to live faithfully with what is still here. Morrigan was never just protection. She was a reminder that love does not leave when strength fades, that purpose does not disappear when roles change, that staying present is sometimes the bravest act of all. If you are walking through a season where life feels slower, heavier, or unfamiliar, this story is a reminder that God has not abandoned you. He may simply be teaching you a new pace, a deeper gratitude, a quieter kind of courage. If this message spoke to your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who may need encouragement today. Leave a comment below and write Amen if you believe that God is still working quietly in your life. Subscribe to the channel so we can continue walking these stories together. And may God bless you, protect you, and give you peace in every season you are walking through. Amen.